Hey, good morning, world. It's Patrick Lovell, Truth Bomb riffing the con at approximately 10:30 a.m. my time on Thursday, December 14th, 2023. And happy Hanukkah to all of my Jewish friends out there, and happy holidays to everybody else. And the subject of today's Truth Bomb is something that I was trying to avoid wading in on, but I think it's impossible not to, all things considered. But as I was thinking about the connectivity to my own life today, I was feeling somewhat compelled, I guess, to try to put this story together because it's wild, but at the same time, it's insanely difficult, horrific, every other human emotion above that you can think of. But it's imperative that we sort of understand each other and get to the right place on this whole thing because I have the information that can turn evil upside down. Now, I know that sounds absolutely ridiculous, but it's true. So, this is my 436th Truth Bomb. I just happened to look back in the archives and I wanted to know how long I'd been doing this. And it looks to me that YouTube says that it's been a year. I think it's been more of a year and a half. Because I certainly know I haven't done this every single day, and I've got 435 truth bombs. So I think I must have gone back to, I think January or February of 2022. It might have been March when we started, to be honest with you. But I just got the first minute or so of my very first truth bomb riff, and the reason I was doing this is because I've been trying desperately to get to the millions of people that must understand the information I have, that the entire space of this ocean of madness and lies and Orwellian universe and doublespeak and misinformation and disinformation and paranoia and hysteria and all of these things that basically are wrestling for control of your mind. And am I the single most important voice that exists on planet Earth? The reason I'm thinking about it is because the information I have is that important. And I'm just the deliverer for whatever that means. And life is just a big puzzle. It really is. And all of the pieces have to fit to tell each and one of our lives, both with granular detail and with a more, depending on the 60,000 foot view and everything from the ground up and back again, right? I mean, life is incredible. And my philosophy of life is it's a miracle. And humanity is a miracle. And humanity can be so full of glorious achievement and so full of just absolute brilliance in ways that are beyond comprehension. And yet we can be so horrific and so evil and so just wrong. And maybe every day is a part of that play every single day in every single direction, but we're at a different space, and it's 2023, soon to be 2024, and we have to find a way to connect. Those of you who are good people, who believe in liberty and justice for all, those of you who believe in the integrity of law and accountability and a way that society must function so that the better angels of our nature rise above the demons of disaster. And maybe that's the ultimate play. I've always been fascinated with that, that mask that projects theater. It is, pure joy and laughing and comedy, and it's a comic, and then the other side of it is misery, tragedy, crying, disaster. In fact, I think there is the divine comedy. It's the divine comedy, which is all of that in one. And so, we're really in a situation where, and I'll just say it off the top so that those of you who have tiny bandwidth can move on to the next thing. But I'm a muckraking journalist. I've got the blueprint of the truth that controls everything. It's the $33 trillion truth in 2011 that morphed into now the $70 trillion truth. There's a billion, there's 1,000 billion and a trillion. This is the story of how everything you think we are, if you believe we are a democracy, if you believe that the rule is supreme, if you believe that power is accountable, if you believe that we're a nation of opportunity and freedom and all of those things that we've been brainwashed to believe we are. We're not, because of what I have. And all roads lead to the simple intersection that Federal Reserve Act 13.3 was used illegally by the powers that be, which is the Federal Reserve, and quite frankly, Congress acted as offense to make sure that nobody understood what was going on with the presidency at the time, which was Barack Obama's presidency, which came in after George W. Bush's presidency, that put all of this in play, that ultimately allowed this insane betrayal and incredible grift to overcome everything. The Supreme Court acted as defense to make sure that nobody understood what was going on. And then ultimately, the media was a giant smoke and mirrors act to make sure that you didn't understand what happened and why. Because the system saved itself. The system saved the rich. The system saved the professional class. The system saved the oligarchs around the world. That what was on the line wasn't what they were saying was a Great Depression, because most of the world, especially most of American society, experienced a Great Depression. It was just the top, let's call it top 10% that really didn't. It was the top 5% that did very well. The top 1% did extremely well, but the top 0.001% got away with the crime of human history. Financial crime. There's a lot of crimes, obviously, that include human suffering and tragedy and death and destruction and all of those things, of which we're in the midst of which I'm going to stick my toe into, and which I was reluctant to do, but I have to, because the whole purpose of these truth bombs is to reflect and refract what everybody's attention is on, and then back engineer to understand what it is that I'm revealing to you that has to break through, over the walls, through the walls, under the walls, through the gates, however possible, to your mind to unlock the reality of what I just told you, which means that everything is a lie. Now, I know everybody thinks that, but everybody points the fingers in every different direction because it's somebody else's lie. No, the system itself is a lie. And what I am attacking is the tumor, which is corruption. Because this isn't corruption in an ethereal sense. It's not that people do strange things behind the scenes because they have aligned interests and they're looking out for themselves, which is all true. But this is criminal by statute, by the way the system is structured, such that this is an impossibility, but yet it happened because everybody was in on it. And I knew that when I had to go on this mega journey, this odyssey that took 13 years of my life, ultimately. It took millions upon millions of dollars. It sacrificed everything. I mean, I was in a situation in 2008 where I was close to throwing myself off a cliff because nothing made sense and I was powerless. And I'm not a guy that likes to be powerless. And I had my family on my back and I couldn't do anything. And I felt like I was suffocated in some sort of maze that I couldn't get out. And I just wanted to end it because I had failed completely. And I couldn't look myself in the mirror with my son, basically depending on me. And it was desperation. And miraculously, we came through that. Miraculously, I was able to put things together because of who I am and what I do. And I've said that in many of my 435 truth bombs. And I would encourage you, if you want to find out more about me, to do so and take the deep dive. I'm in a different mindset. It's interesting. I don't feel like I need to sell anybody anymore. I'm coming from a place of complete confidence. And it might be part of the 10,000 hour rule. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the 10,000 hour rule, but it's said, and people have done studies on this, and especially those that are very successful, that you can't be unless you put 10,000 hours of effort into something. And that's the baseline. And I have into what it is that I'm giving you. And so I'm not coming from a place, and this happens all the time in social media, where somebody basically is like, I don't know what you're talking about. I have no idea where you're coming from. Well, because everybody is overwhelmed with so much information that if you're just looking for a snapshot, like something that you see on TikTok with some beautiful girl dancing or somebody doing some extraordinary act of human achievement, whether it's action sports or strength or MMA fighting or any of those things, not to mention the sex and the more sex and every other sex, and then also all the stupidity, but it's a lot of imagery that is battling, for bandwidth in your mind. And yet you live in a society, and I'm speaking most directly to Americans. This does apply to the world, but most to the Americans based on where I come from and what it is that I have to try to somehow galvanize, electrify, turn on, and tune in. At least, I'm going to call it 13 million people at a minimum. I think it's going to take 30 million people to get to where I want to get, to be able to actually make the first power rungs into the apparatus to maybe start to change things, and it's going to be a long process from there. But in my journey, I went from not knowing anything to years and years and years of effort and millions of dollars to knowing everything about the subject. And because of that, I'm the only guy that has the answers. That's willing to talk about them. That's willing to plow them into your skull. That's willing to do whatever it takes to tell the truth, because the truth matters above all else. The truth is the only way forward. The truth is the light that can overcome the darkness of evil. And that's why I was put on this earth. I'm absolutely convinced of it. And I don't mean that cliche and some sort of divine thing. It's part and parcel to what we do and we configure in our minds, and it's part of the puzzle that we create for ourselves. And yeah, if there was some sort of, metaphysical thing that has, some sort of reward if you've done it all right, well, I guess I'll find out in due time. But I'm not banking on it. And I can tell you, for all the pain and suffering that I've endured, especially the second round of it, because after I got all of the information that I'm telling you, which you can go find, and if you want to bail out now, if you want to come back to this truth bomb later to try to understand what it is that I'm saying, you should probably know my work first. So you go to www.thecon.tv, and millions of people have to go there, and you have to share this. You have to watch it yourself. You have to share it, because it's the blueprint that reveals how the system of financial criminality operates that has controlled our government of the most powerful country on earth, that basically the world's currencies revolve around. And everything revolves around this. No matter what your issue is, it revolves around this. If your issue is the climate, you want to tune in and understand what it is that I'm revealing to you. If it's systemic racism, if it's the war that I'm about to get into in Gaza, in Israel, it revolves around this as well. Everything is in power because of what you don't understand and what we're not. Because in a country of, by, and for the people, where the citizen actually had the information to think in his own best interest, and if that citizen understood the way society is, created, and what ultimately the entirety of the whole experiment of the United States was to hold power to account. And of course, our founding fathers said it's a great system if you can keep it. And then, of course, Jefferson said that the tree of liberty has to be quenched with the blood of tyrants and patriots to make it happen. And all of this is true. But the question that you're going to have to ask yourself after this, if you can get through this whole situation, primarily, first, again, I have to remind you, if you want all of the information in absolute perspective, you should go to the con first at www.thecon.tv. That's going to take you 5 hours to get through. And it's the most important information that exists. It's the actual formula and the revelations of how this huge corruption operates and how it exists, first and foremost. But unfortunately, it was only the first chapter of what I had intended to be season 2 of the con that never happened, because the system got wind of it, primarily BlackRock, the most powerful entity in our country and possibly the world, because it is a superpower, because of what it's doing and what it was allowed to do, because of all of the things that I revealed to you that many of my nemesis on the dark side are now using as their sort of like boogeyman, but it is the boogeyman, but they don't understand how it operates and why. And I do, and that's what I'm telling you. But most of the other information is in what I call the New Untouchables. It's a podcast that has all of what was intended for season 2 of the con, but I couldn't make it. So I ended up doing this podcast called The New Untouchables. Just do a Google search and then watch that if you can. It's another 20 hours. So you're up to 25 hours of information, but of detailed information, of facts, of evidence, of how the system works and operates, to what end and what it did and what it got away with, that buried tens of millions of people illegally and hundreds of millions of people around the world to provide tens of trillions of dollars illegally to the engineers and the denizens of disaster that pulled this fucking off, which has complete control of the United States and I'd say complete control of the world, minus a lot of these wars that are symbolic of it or pieces of it that I'll try to address if I can get the thoughts out of my mouth in a cohesive way. But the truth bombs that you can find at Patrick level truth bombs, the con. This is the 436th truth bomb. All of them have pieces of what's happening every single day in, let's say, the echo chamber, the news, what everybody, the news cycle is talking about, and reverses engineers everything that we're dealing with so that you understand what I'm telling you is the causation and the tumor of it all, and you are nothing but a tool in the full circus if you can't wrap your head around what it is I'm handing you on a platinum platter. And I've got this crazy confidence in a way that I never have before because, ironically, it's almost comedic in a otherworldly sense that I know I'm being suppressed, shadow banned, censored by the most powerful apparatuses that exist. I'm absolutely convinced. Now, I don't have evidence of this part, but I'm absolutely convinced because of the way things work and because I'm a producer and I understand how deals get made, especially through these verticals of these massive platforms that are tied into much bigger corporate hegemonies, where there is an approval process to where you got to go up to the top to where the top is aware of everything that they're involved with. And if they got wind of the fact that there was a story that puts their control in jeopardy based on the scheme that they've completely gotten away with for the past 13, well, it's 13 years, really. We could start the clock at 15 years ago, but it was really 13 years ago that all of this came to fruition. And it never stopped. That's why I continue to tell you that I've got the largest criminal conspiracy and cover-up in history that never ended, that all of this is a sideshow in which, to use the metaphor and a pop culture kind of reference to this Game of Thrones, where there is a battle for control of A, the Iron Throne, which is the White House, and B, the Iron Bank, which is the Federal Reserve. And the ones that actually have the potential to control it are those that already do, which is the neoliberal Wall Street meritocracy revolving door, which represents the Democratic Party and all things Joe Biden. They've basically been in control of our system for about 50 years. And it's all predicated and built on really the paradigm that has existed since World War II, which is oil. And I'll circle back to that. But the ones that are challenging for the throne in the Iron Bank is what I call the new Confederacy. It's just simply a white supremacist hierarchy that is a continuation of everything from the Old South through Jim Crow, through the John Birch Society that's been there, through the Koch apparatuses that created the Tea Party that led to MAGA, and oh yeah, this dumb fuck Donald Trump, who's the ultimate befuddling, almost Three Stooges-like buffoon of a criminal that has been able to work his way through the system because he had friends and powerful players who know how the system works. And I'd say his number one partner is Putin. Yeah, people talk about, especially Matt Taibbi and others, Russiagate, and they scoff and they laugh. Yeah, it's absolutely so absurd, it's incredible. If you understand anything about Russiagate, what they're talking about is the Steele dossier and all things, the Clinton sort of apparatchik. Okay, maybe all of that might be something to blow holes in, but not the relationship between Putin, Deutsche Bank, and Donald Trump. I've done many truth bombs on that. That's not the subject of this truth bomb, but that's the deal. But because of that, and because of the white right-wing billionaires that are basically neo-Confederates, and they're made up of everything from the Koch apparatus to the Mercers, and we saw this whole thing play out in Cambridge Analytica. They're now doing the version of what the KGB's tech apparatus did in 2016, where they got everybody to fight each other because of all of these troll farms and all of these things and the way they operate. And that's what they're doing really in a nuclear way with X because for whatever reason, Elon Musk is in on it. And I think it's because Saudi's in on it. And X is a platform for basically misinformation, propaganda, disinformation. And yeah, Elon's censoring me in a way that BlackRock censored me. So BlackRock censored me in our work by making sure we couldn't get this to mainstream through the likes of HBO, which is where it belonged. But now we've offered it for free because the only thing Americans buy are lies. And the truth cannot be suppressed. The truth will find a way, whether or not I'm there to see it. Kind of like Moses and the Promised Land. But however that turns out is really up to you. But the matrix or the playing field is the new robber barons versus the new Confederacy, and neither one of them are about liberty and justice for all or a government of by and for the people, which is what I am pushing with everything I have. And it's like pushing a boulder up to the top of Everest backwards without shoes on by myself. And I need millions of you to come on board and push this boulder up to the apex of Everest and then push it over the backside to be where it becomes this snowball that becomes this avalanche that buries corruption and the fascism it fuels. And the only way I can do that is with 13 million of you to start. And we really need to get to 30 million. And I am asking you for $13, one-time $13 contribution after you watch my 10,000 hours worth of information, if you can get there, because I don't know what you put value on, but we're putting together our 501c4 and our board of directors and our LLC and our website and all of these things, which all cost money. And it's got to come from you, because we've got to create this tidal wave populist crusade to purge corruption and the fascism it fuels, and it has to come from the people. Why? Because I already did it with the billionaire, and it didn't make a dent because billionaires spend billions to loot trillions, and they've got complete control of the system, and that's what I'm telling you. And it's tyranny, and it's betrayal, and it's corruption, and it's evil in every sense of the word, and it has absolute control out of everything in every theater, and I'm now going to jump into that, but I want to finish with this. The $13, your one-time $13 contribution, that's all I want. If you want to spend more, PM me. If you want to get involved and you want to do more, PM me. If you want to become a partner, PM me. There's all sorts of ways we can what's the analogy that I want to think? There's a million ways to thread the needle. There's, ways we can slice the fucking, the situation, whatever. The perfect analogy is not coming to me at the moment, but we have to raise the capital because the Supreme Court said money is speech, my friends, and anything short of a violent revolution, which we the people are not going to win against the most powerful military on earth unless everybody in the military comes to our side. By the way, that's how they did it in Nazi Germany, and that's another story that I've laid out in my truth bombs. But we have to have, where I'm coming from is I fight for liberty and justice for all and the integrity of law, and that comes from character. Because I learned a long time ago that there's two columns of our soul, and this is what you have to battle yourself. You've got courage, integrity, and decency and dignity versus hypocrisy, duplicity, and complicity. The better angels of our nature, the denizens of disaster. The greatest trick the devil ever played was to convince the world it didn't exist. And what I'm giving you is the light in every single direction that makes the villains, the worms, the worst possible, the worst vermin you can possibly imagine into the light. And I intend to crush them. Yeah, but my methodology is to use what's left of the law and what's left of democracy to turn the tables, and obviously media, because all of media is dead. And everything that I'm offering you, by the way, because I am a producer and because I produce the truth, are alternatives if we really had a free market to where you would be like, you know what, I know they're all lying to me. And what this guy, Patrick Lovell's talking about is coming from the same place I am, because I believe in liberty and justice for all. And I want a country that is the United States that I grew up with. And so I'm down with this guy, Patrick, because I know that Trump and the zombie apocalypse of MAGAs are going to fascism. And I'm not going to allow that to happen. But wait, I don't have really any alternative with this neocon 4 decades long, neoliberalism that has completely betrayed us all. Yeah, it's a real conundrum. And it's even worse than that, as we can see in Gaza and Israel and everything that comes from that conflict that we're all now focused on, that I've got to unfortunately deal with, and this truth bomb that I don't really want to. But again, it's putting all the pieces of the puzzle together, and we have to come together. We have to lock arms. There has to be tens of millions of us locked and armed with the truth that the entire system hid from you. And you have to walk with me, and we have to walk to the light. And if we do so, there's still a chance to get our control of the country back, because that was ultimately the objective that was laid out by my investor that decided to invest to give me the opportunity to go on this amazing journey, this voyage, this odyssey from hell that destroyed my entire life, not once, but twice, because it did it again to me in 2020 because of the same situation, honestly, the exact same situation that drove my wife insane, and justifiably so. Destroyed my family life, destroyed my American dream, almost killed me. But the worst mistake the devil made was that he didn't. And because I'm living and breathing, I'm going to destroy him. And him is evil, metaphorically, across the board, analogous to the wicked that has absolute control. If you will take the time, and if truth and dignity and decency and integrity matters to you, then you're going to join our tidal wave crusade to destroy all that is destroying us. So, the task at hand, the conflict in Israel and Gaza. Now, like I said at the beginning, all of our lives are pieces of a puzzle, myself included. And I find myself putting all of these pieces of the puzzle together with these truth bombs, quite frankly. And I found that, as I was thinking through whether or not I wanted to tackle the situation, I got, I don't know, somewhat inspired, I guess, compelled in a way that almost felt like, yeah, it has to go this way. And it's off the heels of everything that actually, like everything, I've been experiencing this week. So on Tuesday, I went to the movie theater by myself. And I wanted to see a movie that I've been planning on seeing for a very long time. And fortunately, it was still out in the theaters. And one of these great theaters with, like the lounge chairs and the huge screen and the fantastic sound and all of the wonderful things that coming with seeing fantastically produced cinematic, monsters and these gems, on the big screen. I mean, that's the whole purpose of theater. And I go, on Tuesday, where you can see movies for $5 as opposed to the $13 or $17 that they are most of the time, right? And so I go, and I'm the only one in the theater. And what film did I choose to see? Oppenheimer. And so as I'm sitting in that theater alone, and I've got my phone off, and I'm paying incredible attention to every detail on that screen, and I'm watching what I think is probably the most important story of our time, separate from what I'm telling you, but from a sort of impactful, in the moment and what's already happened scenario, yeah, the acquisition, the achievement, the development of what gave us the edge to our enemies on, obtaining nuclear capability and capacity that would ultimately go to hydrogen was, probably the most impactful moment in human history. And Oppenheimer, the guy who was in charge of the whole thing, genius physicist, as it turns out, a Jew, one that among many of the other genius physicists at the time, all were involved or hailed from Germany. Germany was far in advance of the rest of the world in terms of nuclear theoretical sciences, atomic theoretical science and that sort of thing, most notably because of all things Einstein, another Jew. And as it turns out, there were a lot of Jews. I think a vast majority of those in this discipline were Jewish. And it wasn't lost on them when things came together to create the Manhattan Project that put Oppenheimer as basically the lead to put it all together to make it all happen. Most of his team were Jews. And it was incredible because, of course, the Nazis. and the Germans. And I'm Jewish. As I've said in many truth bombs before, I'm not very religious. I come from a mixed background. It's important to say that on my father's side, my father comes from a German English background. Lovell means the wolf, interestingly enough. And my grandfather, my father's father, got into the military in the Army when he was 17 years old. And he went and he fought in World War II. He was at the Battle of the Bulge, and then he ended up in Korea. And an ironic twist of fate in the tragedy of the universe, he ended up going to a job interview in Searchlight, Nevada. We're on our way to California, and he was in Searchlight, Nevada, and he got hit head on by a drunk driver. That's how the story goes, at least in my family. And so a guy who sacrificed for country in some of the most incredible battles of U.S. history ends up dying, ironically, in a drunk driving accident. Hey, it happens, right? His wife, my grandmother, was born Lutheran. She's from a German family, blue-eyed, absolutely beautiful woman. She looked like a movie star from the 20s or from the 30s. And she, had one child, my father, and my father is an incredibly smart guy. He ended up as an attorney, an executive in an oil and gas company. He looked like Roger Moore back in the 70s. And I just give you all that information because it kind of paints a picture of who I am, right? And my mother's side of the family is Jewish. And I think my mom is one of the prettiest ladies alive. And she's Jewish. And I think there's a lot of very beautiful women that are Jewish. And I think my mom is one of them. And she looked like a Nat Funicello, quite frankly. But my grandfather, on my mother's side, was really the ultimate inspiration to me. His name was Bob Presser. He was an incredible oil man himself, a sales guy. He had a company called Presser Royalty. He actually owned the New York Giants, or a part of the New York Giants, back in the 50s, and he got scared and he sold them. And I actually was able to confirm that, which is a trip. I could have actually been born into becoming a guy that owned the New York Giants. If my grandfather was able to hold on to him, but he didn't. He sold him, and I think he did sell to Tish. But the long and the short of it is, he was a dynamic sales guy. He actually worked on Wall Street. He was an attorney. He was there before the Great Depression. Then he ended up after the Great Depression relocating with his brothers to create a company down in Houston, Texas, because he was into oil. And his whole shtick was, and he reminded me of George Burns. He always walked around. Well, he was a combination of George Burns and Winston Churchill, because he was always fond of sayings. And he used to smoke the cigar, and he used to say, "You drive for show and you putt for dough." But he also inspired me to no end, and a couple of other things that he planted in my head early when we used to watch football games every Sunday, which was really my religion. And we'd go get pastrami sandwiches from his favorite deli in downtown Houston, which was the best pastrami in the world. And we'd nosh, and then we'd go on a walk during halftime where he'd smoke a cigar, and he'd tell me stories about the world. And he'd say things like, "Look, Patrick, mankind is incredible. It's the most beautiful symphony of knowledge and achievement and glory and all things that come with the impossible becoming possible. And so anything is possible. But you must know that the world is also filled with villains. And there's a horrible underside of humanity. And you have to be willing to fight. And you must love to fight. And you have to understand that you must fight to become who you envisioned yourself to be. He planted in my early sort of evolving brain structure, with football being a lesson to everything, quite frankly, that everything that influenced me for the rest of my life. And so I always understood that you had to fight. And so one of the things that my granddad, in fact, I opened up my my movie Forward 13, which is my first movie that led to the con, with his words, where he said, my three most favorite things in life. My three most favorite things in life are the Rocky Mountains, Manhattan, and the 4th of July because you're always looking up. And then we talk about Nazis. I was born in 1968 because that's 45, 48 years, right? Let's see, 1945, 68, 23 years, right? Do the math on that. What am I talking about? So 45 to 75 would have been 30, but I was born in 68. So 45 to 65 is 23 years later. I don't know why I was having a hard time with that math. 23 years later. Only 23 years later from the end of World War II. And I'll never forget a lot of other things with my granddad. We used to go to synagogue, and we'd listen to Kol Nidre, and he'd weep tears, and it was just such an emotional guy, but he was such an inspirational guy. And these things were basically my DNA, everything I just explained to you, right? And so I moved forward in my life with that sort of juxtaposition as an only child to Bob and Roberta Lovell from this mixed background, but with all of these different kinds of influences, to know that I had what it took to be strong, that I had what it took to achieve my dreams, and that I had the tenacity and the will and the everything. I had all of the sort of the right stuff to do what I had to do in life. I always knew that. And so I was never afraid of anything. I never bowed to power or pressure, or I was never intimidated by anyone or anything. And, I fought very hard for what it was that I ultimately did in my life, which led me to a moment after the 2008 great financial crisis put me on a cliff's edge to want to kill myself and destroy it all because I couldn't become the guy that I had envisioned myself to be because there were powers far bigger and more prevalent than I that had put me into a predicament. But one thing led to another. I made myself a promise to find out what had happened. And that promise is what I achieved and what I'm giving to you on a platinum platter, which if tens of millions of you understood, we would change the world. But what's that have to do with all things the war in Gaza and where you're coming from? Well, first, I want to tell you a story about me, and then I want to get back into that. And so, you might be saying to yourself, well, haven't you been telling me the story about you? Yeah, well, I guess I have. But there's more pieces to the puzzle that I think are really strangely animated in terms of everything that's playing out right now. So, given the paradox of everything, not paradox, but given the sort of projection that my granddad and my father and my background determined for me, and as I went forward, I always had a chip on my shoulder. So my first experience with dealing with anti-Semitism was in elementary school. I was in 5th grade, and there were some 6th graders taunting me about being Jewish in Israel because it was the 1973, maybe I was in 4th grade. I'm pretty sure it was the 1973 war. I'm pretty sure that was it. It must have been. No, because I would have been too young at that time. But it was shortly thereafter. There was some sort of something. There was a woman who was obviously anti-Israeli who gave an Academy Awards speech, and she was all in on the Palestinians. And there were some guys that were, basically white Christian, who knows what their background was, but they obviously didn't have any respect for Jews. And they started making fun of Jews and me because for some reason they knew I was Jewish, and I don't know why they knew that I was Jewish, but I was on the playground. And there were 3 of them, and there were a lot of people hanging around, and I kept hearing this voice inside my head of my granddad telling me that, you got to fight, and fighting is what it's all about. And I kind of had in my head, it was a young age, but I threw the first punch with the guy that was talking the most, and I dropped him in front of everybody, and then I sucker punched the next guy. He went down, and the other guy did nothing in front of all these kids who just stood there. And from that point forward, in elementary school, nobody ever hassled me again for being Jewish. The few kids that were Jewish definitely wanted to be my friend, but all of those that weren't Jewish, that I was friends with anybody, were more prone to want to be friends with me. And I said this in many truth bombs of the past. I had a lot of, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant friends. I grew up in a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant community that didn't allow Jews in it 20 years before. And so again, there was this chip on my shoulder. My family had come up, even though I was from a mixed background, but nobody really gives a shit. They're like, you're Jewish. And same with Jews, by the way. They're like, your mom was Jewish, so you're Jewish. And it's like, yeah, but I didn't really pick being Jewish, and I'm not sure what it means, but okay. And so as I move forward in this odyssey, and I go to, Sunday school, which I always hated doing because it got into my NFL viewing and playing on the playground and all that kind of stuff with my friends. But I did it because my parents made me. And ultimately, I went to Hebrew school and I got my bar mitzvah. And in my bar mitzvah, I'll never forget working with my rabbi, and my rabbi telling me, what is the subject that you want to talk about that makes you feel most akin to God? And it was honesty and integrity. Because my layout, my blueprint at the time was that when you do good by others, good things happen to you. When you tell the truth and you treat people fairly and you treat people with dignity, they're going to do the same thing to you. That's the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And that was my subject. And I recently reread my speech, and it was on the money. It was just about doing good. And also, though, from the standpoint of, being competitive and fighting bad people. That was always part of the formula. So I'm like, all right, well, that definitely confirmed me being Jewish. I became a man at 13, and everything that elucidates within being Jewish. And yet I was a Reformed Jew, and at the time, back in the 70s, we planted trees in Israel. We always planned on going to Israel. We were definitely about the democracy in Israel. And, the Palestinians were always those that were trying to murder us, on top of all the Germans and the Nazis that did murder us. And not to mention, when you learn more, and I became very fascinated with the subject, and I became, I'd say, pretty obsessed with Nazis and all things Adolf Hitler. But then I learned about the pogroms and all of the millennia of anti-Semitism and where it all came from, and then dialing it back to Judea and, Jesus and who Jesus was and all of these things. And you start to get this big picture where it's just like, well, at the end of the day, it's all fucking ridiculous. At the end of the day, it's just people, galvanizing around specific sorts of hierarchies of powers that people sold to more people to get certain things accomplished that became what they were, that created an end. And, ironically, Jews just kind of survived the whole thing. And when Jews continued to survive the whole thing, as I started off with this section of this truth bomb, they created a lot of brilliant people, a lot of smart people in every aspect of academia, of achievement in science, of the arts and music and architecture, because Jewish people are smart, because we have a discipline of Talmud and the Torah, and you read and you study and you argue and you debate. And that's why Jews become people that are attorneys and doctors and all of these things that are professional class against everybody trying to murder them. And the irony of the Nazis, and of course, all things Oppenheimer, was that Hitler was killing those that could have made him the ultimate superpower. It's a twist of fate. Was that God? I don't think so. Definitely strange. But again, like a lot of things that I've learned about in my life as it pertains to the story of Judaism, it definitely makes me oddly proud. But what's happening in Gaza doesn't make me proud. It makes me sick to my stomach. But as I've also talked about in many of my truth bombs, and some being the subject of anti-Semitism, I lay out what Judaism means to me, and I get to the most important part, which I'm about to get to, if you can stay with me through this, which is extremely important. But the situation in Gaza right now is that a lot of people that you hear talk about, another group of people talk about vermin, and they talk about horrible, dehumanizing situations to where, murdering them is really the good thing. And that's the kind of language that Nazis used to justify, killing the vermin that they considered Jews, or the rats, or the scourge. And of course, rats got the bad, reputation because of the Black Plague, right? Ironically, which gave us ultimately the Enlightenment on the other side of that. But yeah, rats were carrying around the plague, and it spread, and it killed a lot of people. And of course, people had fear, and justifiably so, because if you get bitten by a rat who has the Black Plague, you get the Black Plague and you die, right? Okay, so By the time you get around to Hitler's Nazism after 1,000 years of anti-Semitism, you get to the ultimate final solution, and you get to, all of the things from the ghettos and, the concentration camps. And you have the subsequent murder of 6 million Jews through dehumanizing situations. And no, the world didn't rise to help the Jews. Even though the United States put together a $2 billion apparatus called the Manhattan Project, where they needed a lot of Jews, and they put them in that situation to get the atomic bomb so that the United States could have ultimate superiority. But it wasn't to save the Jews. It was to exploit the Jews, I guess. There was never a parade for Jews after that I ever recall seeing, by the way. So there's that. But going back to my own life, so as I got into junior high school, I was going into my body, and I was a tough guy, and I had a shit ton of adrenaline. And as I mentioned, my dad's like 6'2", and he was a badass rower, and he played football and tennis, and he actually had a scholarship offer for tennis, which was kind of cool. He was all into the bourgeois stuff, but and he was really, really smart, and he got a scholarship for his academics, and he got accepted to Berkeley, and he got accepted to West Point, and he ended up going to Texas A&M University because he wanted to be closer to home, and he got a full ride, and he wound up studying maritime stuff, and he ended up in the maritime, the Merchant Marines, and then he got to the point of captain during the Vietnam era, the Navy, and then he ultimately went back to law school at the University of Texas and got his law degree in maritime stuff, and he was like in charge of these huge super tankers. Is what he did. He'd fly around on private jets and go to Paris, and of which I was part of it. So in the hierarchy of kind of like society, and we all know popularity in junior high school and high school and everything else, it's usually like the jocks, or people are rich and people are popular because they can do things for other people, and we get into cliques and all of those types of things that are predicated upon that. And because I came from this background, of which my granddad taught me that fighting was very important, but all things are possible. And so I concocted all of those things, plus my confidence in my standing in terms of the rich kids, because as I've mentioned in many of my truth bombs before, I grew up with an eyesight of the private gates. I was always in the upper middle class, but I wasn't rich. By today's standards, it's like part of the 1%, but the lower 1%. But I lived within eye distance, or in my case, bicycling distance on my, bike, wearing my KISS t-shirt and hanging out with my boys in our BMX mongooses and all that stuff. We'd go into the gates and we'd go ride around in the neighborhood because we had a lot of friends there as well, but of which one of them was former President George Bush. I got thrown off of George Bush's lawn in 7th grade by George Bush himself. That's pretty funny. So going back to high school and junior high school, so I had all of these things in my mind, but the only thing that people respect are power and fear. Honestly, that's what it is. And back in our days, we didn't have phones, right? So we couldn't film everything, and we couldn't use that to like show how great we were at dancing or at sport or whatever. People got that information through reputation, or you showed them in real time. And a lot of that had to do with fighting on the playground or in the schools and the halls as you moved up through the system. And by the time I was in junior high school and I was wearing, at this time, I guess, AC/DC t-shirts, because I get it at the concert that I go to, or Van Halen. And at that time, I remember really fondly, and if you're from my generation, you'll understand this and remember this. You remember, because we didn't have phones, we were always doodling, on paper, and people would make the Van Halen, insignia, or KISS or AC/DC, and there'd be rock and roll pictures and all that kind of stuff. And I did a lot of skateboarding pictures because I was way into skateboarding back in the day. But yeah, man, I'd wear my AC/DC shirt, and this is back in I guess this was in the early 80s. And then I started to get into punk rock. And so I'd have like, my band with my leather band strap with like, the studs, and, I had the belt. And then I started to move into like vis-a-vis the Cars, into like, like kind of new wave music from heavy metal. But then eventually I found my way to, like, for example, the Clash, and Joe Strummer became my thing. And, during this time, I was really trying to kind of set the tone for who I was. And I remember there was a lot of these Mexican gangs that we used to call the cholos that would like have specific parts of the school where no white boy would set foot in, otherwise they'd get their ass kicked. And as I'm going through this process of kind of proving what a badass I am, and I'm being seen at these punk rock gigs and on the skateboard and on the football field, and I always played football, right? I was always the football guy. I started to do stupid shit, and I started to like test the waters. And I remember one day, this classmate of mine gave me some speed, which was not a good idea for somebody who was high octane as I was. And I went down to the Cholo Square, and I just fucking stood there like, bring it. And I did. And I got jumped, man. And I got jumped by 3 of the heavy hitters, man. And 2 of those heavy hitters wound up getting killed in gang violence, by the way, I found out years later, because they were the muscle for the cartels. These were the kind of people that I was mixing it up with because I was nuts. And I got into this massive fight, and I remember just going at it and doing everything I could, but I got freaking beat to crap. But these bros had respect, as did the rest of the school. The rest of the school was like, bro, dude, you're fucking nuts. Now, I grew up in Texas, so this was all my culture in Texas. So I knew Texas. I was now moving up the ranks, and I was starting to, have the pretty girls and the popular girls and the cheerleaders, and they were all down with me, man. And they thought I was the dude, and I was there, and I was kind of like in that position and going towards high school to where I was going to probably, be in student government, because I was also very into politics and studying, and I love science, and I was kind of an academic guy too, if you can believe that. But at the same time, all of these other things are going on socially. But by the time I got to high school, it was the early 80s, it was like kind of early mid 80s at the time. And something catastrophic happened in my life. My dad, who was of course this corporate executive, and we lived in a nice neighborhood and everything seemed extremely secure. It was the go-go 80s, and there was a lot of what we call mergers and acquisitions back then. And my dad wasn't general counsel; he was principal counsel. So there was a upheaval because there was a mega merger that, as it turns out, and I didn't learn until many years later, that Goldman Sachs of all entities put together, and they merged my dad right into losing his job, which created all sorts of upheaval in my household. And so that was the first time in my life where suddenly my incredibly secure world that enabled me to have this confidence to do all of those things that I've just described for the last however long this has been, to be able to do that. And suddenly we were in disarray. But because I was older now and I had all this mega confidence, I knew everything was going to work out just fine. And it did. My dad got a job really quick, as it turns out. I thought it was longer, but I found out later that my dad got a job really quick. And the choices were, he got many offers to stay in Houston or to move on to Los Angeles or to go to Salt Lake City. And my mom wanted to go to Salt Lake City because she just loved skiing. She went to high school in Europe, and the houses were cheap, and we could live in a nice neighborhood. And my dad was losing a lot of his income, but at the same time, my mom really wanted to live in the mountains. And we ended up with a condo in a place called Park City, Utah, and then a house in Salt Lake City in the mountains. And I had to change high schools. And so that was a real big trip for me, because I went from being super, super confident, very well known, and very popular to being the new guy. And I was definitely somebody who stuck out like a sore thumb. Like I said, by this time, I'm wearing Clash t-shirts, and I'm wearing wristbands that are, these studded spikes, and I love to skateboard. And here I was moving to this cold, sort of mountainous place, at least compared to flat Texas. And I was like, okay, I just got to get through high school and we'll figure it out, and I'll go to college and then whatever. But at the same time, I'm a young guy, and I'm, going through my hormonal thing, and I want to meet girls and all of these other things. And so, I'm just going to be me. And it's also the 80s, and it's kind of like, okay, well, you've got this personality and you're strong. You've already proved yourself in Texas, which is as tough as they get. You're going to be fine just here, right? So I come to Utah, and as you would expect, Utah is filled with a lot of LDS culture. And I didn't know what to think about it at the time, but one thing I learned really quickly, because we lived in downtown Salt Lake City, that Salt Lake City had interestingly enough, at this time, a really strong punk rock contingent, and it was a really relatively in pockets super like antithetical to what you would think of as Mormon. In fact, there's a movie called SLC Punk, of which I actually walked right into. I mean, that was the world I walked into, and so immediately I found friends. But I was a football guy and I wasn't yet a skier, but I really wanted to become a skier because I was a Texas transplant and we skied every year, like once a year, but that wasn't skiing like Wasatch Front skiing. So I became friends with the skaters that taught me how to ski, and God, were they super cool, and they were my culture, and they were like me, like into punk rock, and they were just beautiful guys. I love these people to death. And in fact, they were some of the coolest people I've ever known in my life, and still to this day now. And yet I played football, and I was in that culture as well, and the jocks and everything else. And there was this one kid, and there was a lot of Mormons on that, and so there was kind of this contradiction of like the scenes that you fit in, but I fit in all these different scenes, and there was this group of dudes that I became friends with because I had to on my football team because that's just how it goes. And there was a guy that I worked out with all the time by the name of Tom Cannon. And this dude was a cannon. He was a fucking badass, and he was funny as shit. And he read these Louis L'Amour books, and these books were just amazing. And he got me to read them all, and we started playing water polo together, and we were good friends. We got in a lot of trouble, and then we kind of split. But I remember reading these books, and we used to laugh about these characters that they referred to as rat face, and that was just hilarious to me. And there was this party my senior year. And by the time we get to my senior year, I'm like moving on to college. I got accepted to college. I'm not quite, because I'm, this guy that's a little bit of an outlaw, I should say, but I can move in all of the different cliques. And I was at this big party at this big house, at this friend of ours house, the biggest house in Salt Lake City, by the way. And there was a great night and everything else. And I learned later that Tom had gotten the mayor of Salt Lake City's pregnant. And he was really getting drunk that night because he was all tweaked out about what was going on. And I had just tried to hook up with this other beautiful chick that night, and she turned me down because she liked this other guy, so I was in a foul mood. And I'm walking towards my house, which was right down the street from the biggest house in Salt Lake City. And there was a group of guys there that I played football with who were kind of like the elites. I mean, I was elite too, but they were like the elites. They were like the super, like everybody, they were like the guys, and I was kind of like friends with them. But I was more friends with the skier, skateboarder, punk guys, which they weren't because they were jocks and all of that kind of stuff. But I was friends with them because I was a football player and I worked out with them and all that jazz. And so it was all of these different cultures. And as I'm walking back from the party, and Tom, who I'd been lifting with quite a bit with, and Tom and I were in a race to see who could bench press 300 pounds the fastest. And that was our goal for our senior year. And I ended up bench pressing 300. He got 315. So he's slightly bigger than I. He was like 6'2", 215. I was like 5'11 and a half, 200. No, I was 195 at the time. And he had just really big hands. And he was hanging out with these other friends of ours. And they were kind of consoling him, but I didn't know they were consoling him because he was just super fucking drunk. And as I was walking by, he goes, "See you later, rat face." And I was like, "What?" I was like, "What the fuck did he just say?" And immediately in my mind, I started going to this whole thing about Jews and rats, because I knew about Hitler, and I was like, was that an anti-Semitic remark? I mean, he knew I was Jewish, and we were friends, and all that stuff was. But yet we had written this book, and Louis L'Amour and Cowboys and Ratface, and we laughed about it years before. Was that why he was doing it? So I was like not in the mood to fight. I wasn't the best night, and I didn't really want to take on all three of these guys at the same time, to be honest with you, because at this time I wasn't out to prove myself anymore, because I had already proved myself, and I was on to trying to become mature, if you can believe that. I was on to trying to become a guy that would go to college, and I already had my plans to travel Europe for that summer, and and I was going to go do all of these really cool things that were next level. And I decided not to engage, which was the first time in my life at that time that I'd ever done that. So I walked, but I knew I was going to get hazed, and I knew I was going to get hassled the next day at school, or the next Monday. And I just so happened I got this phone call from this bro of mine, and we used to do this stuff all the time where we'd go out on Sundays to like the punk rock stores and buy albums, and get high, and go skateboard and all that kind of stuff. And we happened to go to this cool record store, and they had T-shirts, and I'm looking through this T-shirt rack, and there's this T-shirt of this hot rod, and this thing that said this big rat, this cool rat with like this spikes and like this leather jacket and this hot ride, and it said rat face. And I was like, wow, now that's really weird. So I thought, I'm gonna get one of these T-shirts. And lo and behold, there was this next T-shirt where there was, because it was like this whole line of rat face, and there was this other T-shirt of this guy skateboarding who was throwing this big ass aerial out of the pool, and he looked, I hate to say it, like me. And I was like, whoa. So I bought that shirt, and I knew I was going to have to get into it with Tom at school, and I knew shit was going to happen. But I decided to wear the shirt, and there was this kind of jock corner, right in the front of school, where all the heavyweight cool dudes hung out, and like all the people that were, in with the cool crew. And back again, this is like going back to the '80s, where long before the camera phones and that, I mean, it was cool by what you were cool by what you showed people, and people feared, and the power that you fit in and where you fit and everything else. But by the time you were the senior, people were slightly more sophisticated, but at the same time, a lot of that stuff was going down. And so here was this corner where all of the people were, and I had this shirt on, and I didn't go try to get a whole bunch of people behind me that I could have done, like many other guys on my football team. And, I and my skater friends, and I would have to like do a lot of politicking to make that moment happen. I just decided to go see what would happen. And so all the same guys that had riffed on me and totally hassled me, I had this shirt on, the skate rat, right? And they all saw me walking up, and they were like, dude, and they all just broke down laughing, and they thought it was the funniest thing ever. And I was like, whoa, fuck, I kind of diffused that. That's kind of close call, right? And then this one dude, this guy, Mark, who wasn't part of our football circle, but he was a guy that was kind of a hanger-on, and he was kind of like, he was a good golfer, and he was a pretty cool guy, but he was also kind of like a squirrely, rich kid. And he's like, whoa, that's pretty funny, rat. And he calls me rat, and I turned around and I fucking slugged him right in the chest, because he was not a threat to me. I hit him so hard in the chest. I don't know what got over me. I hit him so hard in the chest, and he freaking bowled over, and people were like, so so it kind of like, in this weird way, I diffused it with like the elite jocks that could have probably hammered me into oblivion if I took them all on by myself, right? But I didn't. It diffused it. It kind of went well. They kind of fucked with me for a while more after that, but then they started going back to my old nickname and my real name, so I diffused that. None of the other hangers-on dared call that to me, so it all worked out. Okay. It was a big thing for me at the time, because the psychological, I was like trying to think about it, but I was like, okay, well, in my mindset, once I threw myself into something, I was all in. Okay. Now, ironically, throughout the next, many, many years, nobody ever called that just ironically again. And I had a great time, and all sorts of stuff happened in my life. But one day in my ski town, where I ended up locating, before I met my wife and had my family, and I was hanging out with all the skiers and the snowboarders, my nickname became Wolf, by a bunch of really cool, great people, right? So I want you to think of that contradiction, okay? Kind of, duplicitous, white, shall we say, frat boy kind of, gamesmanship that tried to take me down a notch, right? Because that's what they do. And we all know that. Anybody who's lived a long enough life knows that the elite kind of do that, right? That's how it operates. Okay, so those cats, for the big background story that I gave you, came up with that nickname for a short time. And then cool people who are super great, dynamic, awesome people came up with another nickname. Okay? Just plant that in the back of your head. All right, so what does all of that have to do with the war in Gaza? Now, this last week, against really what I wanted to do, because I've got the long view of Israel, and I'll just say that Israel has to exist, and that's been my position. And I threw my hat up in the ring a long time ago, because I am progressive, but not the type of progressive that people are attributing all of these things right now to progressivism, which it really isn't. It might be a side of it. But I have listened closely, because when October 7th happened, I was like, okay, it's on. The first thing that popped into my head was, there's no way in hell Israel didn't know this was going to happen. And how did they let this intelligence failure to happen? And the first thing that my mind went to was 9/11, because I know 9/11 was an intelligence failure, but it really wasn't. It was allowed to happen. I know that, okay? That's part and parcel to the other side of the immense, huge information that we have to reveal to the world, and we have to repivot, to reorient the last 20 years because of what's going on. That Saudi was deeply, deeply, deeply involved with 9/11, and our hierarchy of power allowed it to happen for an outcome, which is right in front of our face, which is a continuation of what's going on in Israel and this horrific violence that has seen now over, I think we're getting close to 16,000 Palestinian dead. I know we had what they said initially 1,400 Israelis that were brutally murdered and many women raped and brutalized in the most horrific ways imaginable that I've talked about in some of these truth bombs before, including rape and just God, just the stuff that you think about, and then obviously the right to self defense and determination and all of these other things built on what created Israel in the first place, which is the Holocaust. It is the Holocaust, and yeah, we could talk about, and the reason I never wanted to really go into this is because I do know the history of Israel from 1948 forward. I do know the history of Jews going back a millennia. I could talk about going back to Judea. I could go back to Jesus and Moses and the whole freaking thing. But it's incredible. But what we really need to think about, given everything that I'm telling you about in this mosaic, is that you're hearing this this description of Palestinians as by the Israelis as vermin, as rats, as dehumanizing scenarios to, I guess, justify that in their own mind that by any means possible they're going to defeat Hamas, which are using its own children as shields, human shields, and that much is obvious. And yeah, Hamas had plans to create this war. There's no question about that. But in my mind, everybody's missing the most important piece. And I listened this week reluctantly to Norman Finkelstein, Professor Norman Finkelstein, in all the places that I would normally listen, like Crystal Ball, and some of the periphery stuff that I'm hearing from Kyle Kalinske, who I think is doing a pretty good job on some of his analysis. But again, I think it's missing the most important part. And then, of course, guys that I love and I listen to religiously, and I think are some of the smartest people in the world, like Yanis Varoufakis and his position on Gaza and his position on the war. And, of course, Roger Waters. Roger Waters was one of the most influential people in my life, coming from Pink Floyd and all things Pink Floyd in the time period that I grew up with, but most importantly, his work, The Wall. And as I've said before in my truth bombs, that Roger Moore is not anti-Semitic. He's anti-fascist. But from what he understands and his background and what he's all about, and it's a very compelling one at that, given everything that his father was and did and what happened to his dad and everything that happened in World War II and everything else, Roger Waters has a very incredibly compelling and I'd say incredibly profound outlook. And most of it I think is really right. But I've also been critical of Roger Waters in the past, that he never really engages the Holocaust to the level that he should, all things considered, if he was being fair. But most people see what's on the ground and they respond in a very emotional way. And I can understand probably if I was there myself, right? We've known that Gaza is referred to as an open air prison, which I've kind of always considered it to be, but I've always considered that the Palestinians never really wanted a two-state solution, that there was never a partner in peace, that Hamas came up because of it, and in its charter to destroy Israel as one side of the equation, Hezbollah and the West Bank and all things Fatah. And I could go on and on and on and on. And the most important thing for me about all this, and I want to say this stuff first, is Norm Finkelstein and Roger Waters and Yanis Varoufakis and many of these others, and I've been listening to Scott Ritter as well. A lot of these people are making incredibly compelling arguments, and it's getting more and more gravity by the day, and it probably had more and more gravity the day that there was, several thousand children killed and maimed and murdered, and we see these things that are happening without food and water and shelter and anesthesia and all of these things that are just, oh my God, it is genocide. And it's really, 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 really hard for somebody who is Jewish, who understands the Holocaust, whose entire DNA is never again, that built everything that I've revealed to you in me, to say, because I know that the state of Israel has to exist. I know it does. It has to. But I've also been telling you in my truth bombs, like, incessantly, responding to what was going on prior to October 7th, because there were tens of thousands of Israeli demonstrators in the streets protesting against Netanyahu and corruption, particularly as it related to the judiciary. And I was trying to inform those who were listening that in Israel, that it was a democratic state, but it skewed towards this thing because it became really involved with all the power that I have to unfold for you. And I'm sorry, it takes time. But these things are important, and yet there is a lot of moving parts, and a lot of people refer to as the indispensable nation, like an aircraft carrier that Israel is for the Western powers in the United States. And then, of course, all of the analogies of what that means, and that, no, it's a colonial settler state that, practices apartheid, which I never, ever wanted to ever think about or believe, but I had progressively from about 2015 onwards more. And I was really getting sick of it because I understood Sheldon Adelson. I understood the money to the right wing settlers. And a lot of these guys in Israel are hyper religious, and they're not Zionist. They're Orthodox, and they're all about the God and the land and this and that, but yet they don't serve in the IDF. And I always had problems with that. But here they are being funded, and then everything that happened during the Trump administration with Jerusalem being the epicenter or the capital of Israel and that sort of thing. I'm like, look, this is going to end poorly. And by the way, back in the early 2000s, I was a part of AIPAC. And I just stopped being a part of AIPAC when I couldn't afford to be a part of AIPAC after my world got destroyed. But I started having problems with AIPAC. But I was always interested in the two-state solution. And yet I was always like, yeah, it's not going to happen. In fact, in my mind, and I was always of the mindset of it's not going to happen because the Arabs and the Muslims don't want a two-state solution. That's where I was coming from. And then progressively I saw, well, that this was moving to the right, and it was inevitable that there was going to be at some point a war. Now, I was of the mindset right after 9/11 that we should have attacked Saudi Arabia because oil was so important to us that we couldn't live without it. So we needed to attack and destroy and crush Saudi Arabia and basically expand Israel into Saudi Arabia. I honestly thought that, kind of satirically and ironically, but I was coming from Texas. I was like, you know what? And also my family's oil and gas. I was like, you know what? Let's just fucking draw borders just like the Lone Star State, and let's just put it smack dab in the middle of the East that has the greatest oil finds of the entire earth, and the Guar and whatever the other big ones are. And ultimately, let's just make that Israel. And let's get rid of all of the extreme Wahhabism and everybody else. And then anybody who survives that, massive war and calamity, just like the Japanese and the Germans, we incorporate to create a new world. That honestly is what went through my mind on September 12th, 2001. But what ultimately happened? Well, we had 20 years of war. And I bring this up in the context of really all of those of you, particularly younger people who go to the streets, and there has been both pro and Israel and pro Palestinian demonstrations all over the world, quite frankly. But in Europe, there are a lot of immigrants that came out of the conflicts in Syria in 2014, 15, 16. That in desperation migrated to Europe, and that was a big deal to Europe, i.e. that also led to all of the things with, what is it called with England? I can't even think of it. It's got so much going through my brain. But there are a lot of Arabs in France, and there has been forever because of, the things with Morocco and Algeria and all of these other things. And Algeria is another aspect of, what do they call, not Fatah, but in Islam, when you have the sort of, suicide pact, right? Whatever that is. I mean, all of this has kind of bled into Europe, and it's been there for a long time. And so they've been dealing with it. And so Israel becomes this sort of micro focus of the world. And it has been forever, because of history and all of these things that I'm bringing into this, right? And so, listening to Finkelstein and everybody else and calling for a ceasefire, my God, do I want there not to be war? My God, would I like there to be a ceasefire? My God, would I like for there not to be Hamas. And like I said, Israel must stand. And I am progressive. And so, why is a guy that's trying to reveal to you the largest criminal conspiracy and cover up in history that leads to the revelation Federal Reserve Act 13.3 went behind the scenes as our Congress played offense to lie to us, as our media hid the entire thing, and as our Supreme Court played defense for this whole thing, that the Federal Reserve met behind closed doors 98 times through the act of Federal Reserve Act 13.3 to expand thanks to none other than the consortium, which is the top banks in the country, which are the top 13 banks in the country, that was led by none other than Sullivan and Cromwell. The same Sullivan and Cromwell, which is probably one of the most powerful law firms that was an amalgamation and extension of Wall Street that created the CIA. Oh yeah, they're the ones that were at the front lines to expand what they call the box of the capacity of the full faith and credit of the United States to make the liquidity available to our financial system to save themselves at the world's expense, which, as it turns out, is all predicated, if you really want to know the truth, and I'm still on the fence about this, it's predicated on oil. It's predicated on the dollar being the global reserve currency because oil is gold. Yeah, you know that. I'm not being metaphorical. No, it is. We went from the gold standard to the oil standard. Now, a lot of the experts in economics, which is I've turned out as a massive fraud for the most part because of just the way the whole academic aspect of it works. But they'll tell you, and it's a lot more complicated than I could ever reveal or really understand what we call the plumbing of the Federal Reserve System. But these guys will probably say that no, you don't have to have the dollar guaranteed by global buy-in because of oil, the commoditization of oil. They'll say that we've got enough productive capacity to do all of this stuff. I'm not quite so sure if Saudi Arabia and Russia and China and India and Brazil go by way of the BRICS and create their own currency and they own the world's most oil reserves. And I'm not sure they do anyway, because the United States is drilling more than in producing more oil and gas than all of them at the moment, which doesn't do well for the climate, but what ultimately this whole thing is hinged on. So if you look at what's happening in what all of these guys on the progressive side, the left, are talking about Israel, what they're not talking about, and what I think is the most important thing, is in my mind, there is no way in hell that a bunch of paragliders could fly over the walls of the most heavily policed and intelligence apparatus in the world that had Gaza separated into its 25-mile by 5 enclosure, which is the most densely packed place on earth. There's no way in hell, given what we now know also, that Israel had the blueprints and they understood the planning that Hamas was going to do exactly what it did, and it went through the food chain, and who knows if Netanyahu got the information. I'm sure he did, but I'm sure also the Israeli Defense Force has plans a mile deep and every which way to Sunday with the United States military and all the powers that be, that if they were ever to invade Gaza, for the final solution of Gaza, that they were going to do exactly what they're doing. If Israel had an Iron Dome, and then they can shoot down a vast majority of rockets, what's the likelihood that they just got caught flat because they had their eye on the ball with Hezbollah in the West Bank? I don't buy it. I think it was just like 9/11, personally, because we know in 9/11 that we knew our intelligence agencies, the FBI and the SEC, the CIA, knew where the sleeper cells were. We knew where they were training. We knew what they weren't doing, and we knew who were paying them. Just to get them arrested and put in a situation where we could have broken up the cells without having to go in with SWAT or CIA or special ops or whomever to blow these guys that were ultimately armed with box cutters to fly 757s into the Twin Towers and to ultimately the Pentagon, and then the other one got taken down by my heroes, Flight 93 in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, which happened. And that's where I'm coming from. And by the way, I did go bathe myself in the mud and baptized in the mud of Shanksville, and I carry that with me as well, which is another strange story and happenstance of this whole thing. But what does it all mean in terms of what is going on, right? Well, look, guys, I just need you to understand the basic mechanics of geopolitics, given what the world has done for the last 70 years. What would this conflict look like without oil, first and foremost? What would the world look like without oil? Well, it would look pretty clean, because that means we would have been forced to move to renewable energies, which we already have the technology and the know-how to do. I'd say probably 60% of what we need. We're not there for air travel, and we're not there for I think agriculture, but for transportation and for actual electricity and powering our buildings and so forth in our homes. Yeah, no, we've got that technology now. And so when you look at the composite of power and this aircraft carrier analogy and the liberal powers and all of this stuff, and we get into the ideological spectrum and anti-Semitism versus control and censorship and all of these things that are manifesting and that are going to now take even more time, because I saw it declared this morning on the front page of the New York Times that the Israeli foreign defense minister, or whatever that version of their apparatchik is, announced that it's going to take another month for them to cease what their campaign is. And by the way, Netanyahu said at the very beginning, right when 9/11, when 10/07 happened, October 7th, he said it's war. I think he said it once that I heard, and it's been war ever since. And so for the left, and I hear people like Abby Martin. Okay, Abby Martin, to me, as much as she says things that I know are going to have to protect innocent children who aren't yet Hamas, that aren't, because they're born into it, deserve to die, they don't. And I do buy the arguments of my African American friends that I've heard. They're like, look, we don't. If there's a bunch of gangbangers in Detroit or South Central, we don't, blow up the whole fucking neighborhood. We go find those guys. That's what we do. But the United States is bigger. But this is what I'm telling you, is this has been a plan for a very long time. And I'm telling you that also, because of Saudi's deranged involvement in everything, Saudi is the key consideration, because Saudi, the Abraham Accords, and what Netanyahu was doing was, Netanyahu had made Israel the indispensable state, quite frankly, to the Middle East, vis-a-vis Saudi, vis-a-vis all the shit that they're proving right now. Oh yeah, they can kill everybody with special bombs and ops and this and that and take it out. And it almost seems like it's like this sort of large, what do we do when we go into the lab? It's almost like a lab for the military industrial state. That's what it kind of feels like to me. And they know technology. I think they're proving to Saudi that it's like, look, man, we can protect you and your oil infrastructure and all that the West resides on, and we're, normalize relations with us. Okay, we're going to get rid of Gaza now, and maybe the West Bank next. The thing that's been so interesting to me about all of this is, why hasn't Iran directly attacked Israel? Because that's what I've been waiting on, and I think Iran's going to get their ass kicked when it happens. I know right away, all of the people that were like Chris Hedges, who I listen to all the time, and I love 90% of what he says. I'm not all on board with what he has to say about Gaza and Israel and everything else, but I know where he's coming from, and it's hard for me not to argue with that. But immediately, Jimmy Dore, the loudmouth that he is, says things right away like, oh yeah, Israel is setting itself up for disaster. And you hear all the time, you're like, for every, these are like fear tactics, right? For every child that is murdered through this indiscriminate bombing, they're making 10 more members of Hamas. And what I would say to all of those people who use that as a fear tactic is, what have you not seen for the last 20 years? That's the point. That's what military contractors who live in rich estates in places like Bethesda and Chevy Chase, Maryland, depend on. It's a sure thing. Yeah, they want to mow the grass. Yeah, they want to breed hate. That gives them power to further entrench this system, which is predicated on oil. Always has been. And oh yeah, by the way, I'm starting to see that, and I don't know if there's any of this is true, if there's any of this has been validated, but yeah, I'm getting emails that say that, oh yeah, there's like billions of dollars of oil in Gaza. I don't know if that's true, and if it is, we'll see. But none of it's a laughing matter. It's absolutely horrific. And I really wanted to avoid the subject because most of the people that I know that I think would champion what I am trying desperately to get your attention to understand so that we can get there is that what we're creating with our effort is the clean New Deal. So the way that has to happen in the United States, and we are the indispensable nation, and everybody depends on our global reserve currency and our military power and our, quite frankly, our consumption, and the way that it's been built to where this neoliberal infrastructure created this international paradigm to where credit is what matters. And oh yeah, by the way, we're $33 trillion in debt, which I find interesting that it was $33 trillion that we gave Wall Street illegally in 2009. But we've given them another $40 to $50 trillion since to this tiny, tiny, tiny cabal of people that are fucking us completely. Now, as a Jewish person, I have to say this too, as it goes for anti-Semitism, because I know this is ultimately going to play out. It's got to. But I've got to try to be out in front of it the best way I can, whether you're listening or not, and whether you understand where I'm coming from. But I can tell you, a lot of the executives in both finance, and which means Wall Street, and in our law, and in our media, are Jews. And yeah, they played an overwhelming sort of role in making all of this stuff happen. I've said this in the past. It was Jewish chief executives at CBS and the president of CNN, Jeff Zucker, and Les Moonves, who said publicly that, yeah, they wanted to put Trump out there because it was good for ratings. They played roulette with democracy because they thought it was funny. It's not funny. I don't think Rob Reiner's laughing about it right now, but that's what they did for ratings because that's what they do, because that's what they're in it for. And guys like that, because of their incredibly twisted version of how things are supposed to operate, are sickness. And they themselves are sick. Oh yeah, and by the way, Les Moonves got in trouble with all sorts of, I don't know what, sexual antics and kind of Harvey Weinsteinisms, which I'll come back to in a minute. And then, of course, there are the, some of the top power players in finance. Yeah, there was Robert Rubin and Larry Levitt, who was at the chief of the SEC, and Alan Greenspan, who was head of the Federal Reserve, and, of course, Larry Summers, who came out of Harvard, and all of those Jews were deeply responsible for the largest criminal conspiracy and cover-up in history that never ended. But they weren't the only ones. Like I've said so many times before, Jamie Dimon, even though he came out with Sandy Weil, who was Jewish, but Jamie Dimon isn't. I think Jamie Dimon's Greek. He's probably Greek Christian, Orthodox Christian? Who knows what he is? I have no idea. What's his name? Moynihan? Moynihan is CEO of Bank of America. Yeah, he's not Jewish. He's Irish, right? And so many others. So there was just so many other people that weren't Jews at the hierarchy of this thing that made all this happen. So it wasn't the Jews completely that made this happen. They certainly had an outsized percentage role, and they are guilty of all of this stuff. But they didn't do it because they were Jewish. Nowhere does it say in Talmud, nowhere does it say in the Torah, nowhere does it say in any sort of amalgamation of what creates Jewishness or Judaism in all of its sects, whether it's Orthodox, whether it's conservative or Reform, or Jews for Jesus, which isn't Judaism, or some other Kabbalah, right? Kabbalah was kind of the thing. I remember Madonna was into that. And I'm into some of that myself, but they didn't do it because they were Jewish. They just happened to be Jews. And they really fucking pissed me off to no end. And this is kind of the story of history. Hitler blamed the bankers and the Jews for for Wall Street collapse and the Great Depression, but as it turns out, it wasn't the Jews. They were all white Anglo-Saxon Protestant that ran Wall Street at that time. Yeah, there were Jews in the mix. They didn't run it. I'm reminded of Sinclair Bush, the grandfather and the father of George Bush, and George Bush became CIA director, and his son, and they were all in on Saudi Arabia, okay? And Sinclair Bush was all in on Adolf Hitler. Yeah, that's what these guys do. You want a shortcut to it? Check out Amsterdam, a fabulous movie with John David Washington, one of the greatest actors of all time. My favorite, Robert De Niro. Of course, Margot Robbie, who was magnificent. And of course, Christian Bale, directed by David O. Russell. It deals with all of this stuff. And it was fucking magical. It was absolutely brilliant. And it got it exactly right, by the way. Was it Dudley, the general that Robert De Niro played, and all that stuff is pretty much what happened by the book before World War II, by the way. Yeah, it's what mighty webs we weave when we practice to deceive, and it's always a perverted, inverted sort of scenario. You hear the Republicans talk about, we're not a democracy, we're a constitutional republic, which means ruled by the minority, which in their case is a confederacy, which is exploitation, which is slavery. That's what they want. The robber barons aren't much better. I'm all about dynamism. I'm all about freedom. I'm all about achievement. I'm all about the gift of the brilliance of humanity to create and solve problems. The Clean New Deal is that. We're on the verge of World War III, people. It could go wrong really fast. There's a lot of trigger points. Everything that's happening in the Middle East right now has made us forget about what's happening in Ukraine. And Ukraine is significant. I think there's over 600,000 people died in a year. And yeah, for everybody who wants to compare Jews to the Nazis because of what they're doing horrifically Nazi-like in Gaza, people, they'd have to wipe out Gaza, the West Bank, twofold over and over and over with gas chambers and have stars and do it slowly and send them on trains and to do it in front of the world and the world do nothing to be compared to Nazis. Yeah, it's not a direct correlation, and history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. Okay, I get it, right? Does that excuse what Netanyahu is doing? No. Did I tell you earlier in this truth bomb that is Israel a democracy? There was many Israelis trying to get Netanyahu out because of corruption, and they have been for now over a decade. There are many Jews in Israel that wanted a two-part solution. You really can't say the same thing that I know of. There's no civil rights leaders in the Palestinian territories that I've ever seen. I'm sure they exist. I've seen a lot of very smart Palestinians that I've seen in academia say good things that are plausible, that are thoughtful, but they didn't have the power. Not in, and there's the corruption side of it too, guys. I mean, I know from on high that Yasser Arafat squandered billions that the EU was giving him to give to the Palestinian people, that he and his wife, she had she was spending hundreds of thousands of dollars a month on her wardrobe in Paris, living high on the lam while her people were starving, that became what we call terrorists, or some people call freedom fighters. Their own people did that to them. And the guys that are in charge of Hamas, they're all holed up in, the UAE? They're the guys who are in control, and I think they've squandered a whole lot of money. And then we know that, a lot of the people that they built tunnels with the money instead of, infrastructure, and they were, building rockets instead of, schools, and they wanted to put their people in front of mosques and hospitals because it's sick, because they live for the next life, and that's part of this long story. I don't want to debate and get hung up and have the war in Hamas overtake what it is that I'm trying to tell you, but it's got to be a piece of it. And I had to tell you my whole story and where I'm coming from and what it all means. And I hope that you heard me. I'm an American. I believe in life, liberty, and justice for all. I believe in the dynamism of upward mobility. I believe in the integrity of law. I believe in the integrity of justice. I believe justice is holding bad guys account. I came up in the 80s, the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. Do you think I'm naive to all the shit that happens in the world? No, we saw it a million times over. What do we have with, the largest cocaine dealer of Colombia, Pablo Escobar, that we've kind of almost memorialized as almost kind of like a secret hero because of what he did by giving, his people schools and money and charity and all that stuff by basically getting the world on cocaine. And yeah, those of us who did it, it was kind of fun for a while, right? But he did so, and the CIA took a big portion of that and then turned it into arms, and then gotten people hooked on crack in ghettos, and then, sold weapons around the world through our friend at Saudi, a guy by the name of Khashoggi, by the way, who was the world's largest arms dealer, who was, tied in very closely to the Bushes, by the way, not to mention commercial real estate and all of this stuff. leads to the Clintons and Bushes, and there was a lot of this stuff going on in the 80s because of what we call the savings and loan crisis, which is where all the money was laundered around the world through our banks into places like California and Texas, which was phase one of it. And oh yeah, by the way, it ties back to Donald Trump, who had a thing called Triad Partners, and he was involved with the Saudis too. So yeah, Trump involved with real estate from the very beginning, was involved with first Saudis and then Russians. Okay? What mighty webs we weave when we practice to deceive. The power is really the world's reserve currency of the dollar that runs through Wall Street, predicated on Saudi, and Saudi owns everything. And oh yeah, as I mentioned in a Truth Bomb the other day, another Jew by the name of David Zaslav, who is the CEO of Time Warner, one of the greatest Warner Brothers, greatest Jewish achievements in the history of the world. But it is, for me, as a producer, the brilliance of everything that is good in Judaism, minus a lot of the control that would lead to the types of things that Weinstein would do downstream. And that's another truth bomb. But I'm not proud of Weinstein. I'm not proud of Epstein. I'm not proud of all of the guys that I've talked about. Yeah, a lot of those guys need to be held accountable. And just like I'm getting all of the Steens mixed up, go to prison. Just like literally getting Epstein and Weinstein confused in my head. Just like Weinstein went to prison. And oh yeah, Epstein got killed on Trump's watch. Why? Because I think Trump was in the crosshairs. Trump let all of the girls from Mar-a-Lago be, basically picked out of Mar-a-Lago, and he got his wife from Epstein. There's so much shit that's involved with this. And yeah, I think Netanyahu and Trump are all together. So if you're going to vote for Trump, and it's crazy, this, the white conservative evangelicals are all on board with Israel, man, because they hate the libs. They're going to own the libs, and all the progressives supposedly that are about human rights and justice hate the neo-colonial state that was actually a democracy, and it's all happening now, and it's all trickling in all these different ways. And yeah, could it lead to World War III, which is what, the final war, which is what we call Armageddon, which is what leads to, the second coming through the rapture and all this other bullshit and horseshit. Meanwhile, here's a Jewish guy that fought on his playgrounds, that grew up with what I just laid out to you, that got called by the elites rat, who were trying to fuck everybody over, but at the same time I became wolf with the cool guys. I'm the wolf. That's what my last name is, Lovell. And by the way, my dad's third cousin, who is James Lovell, was the captain of the Apollo 13, came in because NASA all came together, and that's where I'm from, Houston. Yeah, Americans are really good at figuring stuff out when we can. And we have to. And what I'm looking for is all of you. I don't care if you're Muslim. I don't care if you're Christian. I don't care what color of skin you are. I don't care if you're male or female. What matters to me is that you believe in the American dream, and that you have the dynamism to achieve, and that you want upward mobility for the best of your family, and you want the system to work. And what the Clean New Deal is going to do is it's going to take the $70 trillion that has been looted by the system of criminality that's destroying the world and getting us dangerously close to World War III, because the military contractors, I guess, think we're going to survive this. And that there's a way to build upon this. I think they're just playing roulette with our lives, just like Jerry Zucker did with Donald Trump. That's what I think. And I'm going to bring up, because I am an Andy's guy, and I just happened to listen to this morning, and I'm going to close with this. So, one of my favorite musicians of all time, one of my favorite people, a guy who I consider a hero, is Prince. Prince is this black guy who's this short black guy. If you've seen pictures of him back in the day in Minneapolis, he had this afro. And he was a big basketball player. And apparently he was pretty damn good, from what I understand. But of course, he was a musician. He became to become this fabulous superstar that he was, because he's a superpower. And for those of us who are rock guys, and I was punk rock and all that kind of stuff growing up, I had a special love for Prince, because I love the funk. I love the funk, man. And by the way, I'm a big fan of the Red Hot Chili Peppers. They're probably my favorite band going back to the day. But I always thought, what a shame that Flea, that I never saw, came together with Prince. But Pat Smear did, I found out last night, which is really cool. One of the guitarists actually lead guitarist of the Chili Peppers, been around for forever. It goes back to my punk rock days, right? Pat Smear is a god. And by the way, he was in a video with Prince, and that's why I was thinking about it, of Raspberry Beret. If you go watch that really cool song and video, see if you can spot Pat Smear back in the day. But as I was thinking about this truth bomb, and I was looking just some stuff to kind of clear my mind this morning, because I got to do that. I got to clear my mind to just go off on these stream of consciousness truth bomb riffs. That I was watching this video that of Prince performing in Inglewood that my friend sent me, who it was incredible. And Prince was playing the funk. He started with what is it? Play that I'm being such a white boy real quick. Play that funky music till you die. Play that funky music, white boy. So it starts off with that, and then he has the singers in the background, and he goes into this funk about Inglewood, and he has this incredible guitar solo, and the guitar solo is like Jimi Hendrix and Eddie Van Halen combined, but with the funk, and he has this crazy cool pimp cap on and these cool boots, and he's dancing and he's doing his thing, and he's a short dude, but he's got this power of a rock guitar god. And I put him up on the top of Valhalla with Eddie Van Halen and Stevie Ray Vaughan and Jimi Hendrix. I think that's how good he is. And I'm thinking to myself, here's this black dude who's this small guy that represents all of these different sorts of influences, and he brings them out in one moment. And it erupts in my mind like this nuclear emoji. And man, I want to dance with all the beautiful women that are getting functified. You know what I'm saying? And that's what I'm trying to do to you. It's hard to follow along. It's hard to get to know one another in this loud, obnoxious universe when I'm just sitting in a chair in a living room with nothing to look at except for my eyes to hear what's coming from my soul, because I've already proved through my work, www.thecon.tv, the new Untouchables, and all 435, now 436, truth bombs from Patrick Lovell. Because I have the largest revelation in history that can turn everything upside down and inside out, and most importantly, right side up. This is nuclear fusion. You can't hide the truth. If you, me, and everybody you see who isn't a Nazi, who believes in dignity and decency, doesn't just believe, but champions dignity, decency, integrity for liberty and justice for all, that creates sustainability and enables beauty, the upside of the better angels of our nature, then if we merge in unity and come out of our silos by the millions, it's going to take millions of us, and to do so peacefully, which isn't really that peaceful if you really follow through in terms of justice. The justice is to hold these motherfuckers accountable, to pull back all of their money, to make them go broke and see them in a cell, not in Club Fed, but in a real cell. That is justice. To where we reconfigure the $70 trillion that they stole, and we create the Clean New Deal, the renewable infrastructure that emanates out of our heartland, which is the Midwest, that doesn't become the Rust Belt, it's the Green Belt, to where we reconfigure our infrastructure for car manufacturing, where we recreate the golden goose. This is to redeem the American dream. If you and I, if we come out of our solos and we merge in unity, we will defeat the tyranny of misery. And because that is the story of America, that is our destiny. And that is the con. That is the Clean New Deal. But you got to understand the con to get there. Failure is not an option. Rise, roar, revolt. The Clean New Deal. This is the righteous grind. When you have the truth, you're bulletproof. It's not rocket science. It's racketeering. Onwards and upwards.